The university in the city center was old but well maintained. Its massive stone walls had seen students since the early 20th century. Tall, arched windows let in the cold light of the winter morning. The corridors smelled of a mix of old books, coffee, and the faint scent of dust settling on the wooden panels. In the large lecture hall, filled with long rows of desks, Professor Marcus Stanton was preparing for his lecture. He was a man with a reputation for being strict but fair. His thin gray hair barely covered his bald spot, and the old glasses on his thin frame kept slipping down his nose. On the lectern, neatly stacked sheets of notes lay. Marcus clasped his fingers together and scanned the room, where students were slowly taking their seats. "Today we will have a knowledge check," he said, tapping his pen on the lectern. "The questions will be difficult, but that's why we are here, to learn to think, not just memorize." The door at the back of the lecture hall opened, and a man entered wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans. His hair was casually styled, and he held a notebook in his hands. He chose a seat in the back row, sat down leaning slightly forward, and looked attentively at the professor. "Are you a new student?" Marcus asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Well, you could say that," the man smiled faintly. The professor raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "All right," said Marcus. "Let's start with the basics of physics. If I asked you to calculate the force at which a spacecraft enters Mars' atmosphere, what difficulties would you face?" The man in the hoodie raised his gaze. "The atmospheric resistance on Mars is 4 times less than on Earth, but the problem lies in the entry speed and the angle of descent. If the angle is too steep, the spacecraft can bounce off the atmosphere. If it's too shallow, it will burn up due to excessive friction." The professor was slightly surprised. "Correct," he said, stepping back a little. "And what about the speed loss during descent?" "Parachutes are used for that, but due to the thin atmosphere, they are ineffective. So jet engines are used for a soft landing. This causes additional fuel consumption, and—" "Enough," the professor interrupted, smiling faintly. "You are quite familiar with space technology." "Well, you could say that," the man repeated. The professor paused, his gaze sharpening. "Your name?" The man tilted his head and smiled slightly. Elon Musk." A hush fell over the lecture hall. Someone at a desk whispered, "Is this a joke?" Marcus stared at him as if he were a ghost. "If you really are Elon Musk, then what are you doing here?" Elon shrugged. "Today I'm a student. Let's see if I can pass your exam." The professor thoughtfully stroked his chin. "In that case, Elon, let's see how well you know science." Elon barely smiled and opened his notebook. Professor Barkley frowned, staring at Elon over his glasses. "You're telling me you came up with this solution yourself?" Elon nodded calmly. "Yes," he answered quietly. A tense silence filled the room. Several students exchanged glances, someone quietly scoffed, and George, a guy in the back row, grimaced and mumbled, "Oh, here we go. The genius speaks." The professor leaned toward the desk, slowly scanning the room with his gaze. "All right, let's break this down," he said, standing and taking a marker in his hand. He wrote a formula on the board. "If you truly understand how this model works, you should be able to explain it step by step." Elon stood up without hesitation, approached the board, and took the marker. "Of course," he said, beginning to draw diagrams over the equations. "First, we consider the mass and velocity. Then we introduce the drag coefficient, which depends on—" He spoke in a steady, confident voice as the board filled with complex diagrams and numerical values. Professor Barkley stood with his arms crossed, silently observing. The only sounds in the hall were the squeak of the marker on the board and the faint buzzing of the neon lights overhead. "And so if we adjust this parameter, we can increase the system's efficiency by 17.3%, Elon concluded, placing the marker on the shelf next to the board. A silence hung in the air. The professor stepped closer, studying the equations. He touched one of the parameters with his fingertip, smiled slightly, and nodded. Impressive. But Elon clenched his jaw, preparing for criticism. But that doesn't change the fact that you weren't present in the lecture where we discussed this model, Barkley continued. So where did you get this from? Elon met the professor's gaze. I wasn't at the lecture, but I read your research papers, including the article in the Journal of Applied Physics from last May. You mentioned a similar model, but with a different coefficient. I thought it could be adjusted to. The professor sharply raised his hand, stopping him. You read that article? It's not part of the course curriculum. I know, but I found it interesting. The professor looked at him carefully. Then he nodded and turned to the class. Well, it seems we have a student here who decided to go a bit beyond the standard curriculum. Several students shook their heads irritably. George sighed loudly. Oh, of course, another one of the professor's favorites. Elon ignored it. He returned to his seat, but felt several envious glances following him. Nice job, Musk, whispered the girl with red hair in the row next to him. She smiled, and there was a flicker of interest in her eyes. The professor turned back to the class. Well then, today's session is over. Elon, stay for a minute. Elon caught George's gaze, which had become even more sullen, but said nothing. When all the students had left, the professor approached Elon, who was standing by the board, his hands in his jeans pockets. You've got good abilities, Musk. But that's not enough. Elon raised an eyebrow. Not enough. Intelligence is only part of the equation. To really succeed, you need more than just knowledge. You need character. Elon nodded quietly. And there's something else. The professor leaned in a little closer. You're not the first student with great potential I've seen. But you could be the first who doesn't break under pressure. Elon didn't reply, but he felt a familiar sense of challenge stirring in his chest. By the way, the professor added as he walked toward the door, next week I'm planning a test with increased difficulty. I hope you come prepared. Always ready, Elon replied with a slight smile. He remained alone in the empty classroom. Soft light filtered through the windows, reflecting off the board where his equations still remained. He looked at the equations left on the board and thought that the professor was right. Intelligence isn't enough. It takes something more. Elon smiled, grabbed his notebook from the desk, and left the classroom. The next morning, Elon woke up earlier than his alarm. His mind was still running through the equations from yesterday's lecture. He quickly got dressed, threw on a light jacket, and headed out into the dormitory hallway. There were already a few students in the lobby. George was sitting on the couch with his phone in hand, and two other guys were listening to music next to him. George glanced at Elon and smirked. Oh, the genius is up, he said without looking away from a screen. Preparing for the next round of impressing Professor Barkley? Elon ignored him and walked toward the exit. Hey, Musk. George stood up and walked closer. You think you're better than all of us? Elon stopped and looked at him over his shoulder. No, he replied calmly. I just work harder. George scoffed dismissively. Yeah, we'll see how far that gets you. Elon stayed silent and left the dorm. It was cool outside. The sun had just risen above the horizon, casting long shadows on the pavement. He took out his phone and opened his notebook. All the equations he had used yesterday were already organized. But Professor Barkley was right. It wasn't enough. He needed to go further. Elon headed to the library. It was almost empty. He sat down at one of the tables in the far corner, pulled out his laptop, and began working on a new model. 2 hours later, he had something interesting. If he adjusted the resistance coefficient by another 0.03 and reduced the effect of the structure's weight, the system's efficiency would increase by By 22%, Elon whispered to himself. Impressive, a voice said nearby. Elon looked up. It was the same girl with red hair. She was holding a cup of coffee and smiling. Emma, she said, extending her hand. Elon, he replied, shaking her hand. I know who you are, she smiled. Everyone knows. Is that good or bad? We'll see, she said mysteriously, sitting down across from him. Elon looked back at the model on the screen. Emma leaned in closer. What's this? A new model for optimizing energy consumption in spacecraft engines. Spacecraft engines? She raised an eyebrow. Ambitious. Well, if you don't set high goals, why bother starting? Emma stared at the equations on the screen. Do you think it will work? If the parameters are adjusted correctly. She thoughtfully sipped her coffee. We have a physics lab tomorrow. Professor Barkley will probably have something challenging prepared. Good, Elon smiled. I love challenges. Emma laughed. Looks like you have everything it takes to be the best. We'll see, Elon said, hiding a smile. The next day, in the lab, Professor Barkley did indeed prepare a tough task. On the table was a model of a small system simulating the operation of a spacecraft engine. Your task is to increase the system's efficiency by 10% within an hour, the professor announced. Elon looked at the model and quickly calculated the parameters in his head. He remembered his model and realized he could apply it here. He approached the table, connected the power supply, opened his laptop, and began entering adjustments. George stood nearby, watching skeptically. This won't work, he said. We'll see, Elon replied. 20 minutes later, the system was running steadily. The efficiency indicator increased by 12.4%. Professor Barkley approached, looked at the screen, then at Elon. Impressive. George frowned, but said nothing. Emma winked at Elon. Looks like you've got a talent. Elon smiled. This is just the beginning. That evening, Elon lay in bed for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. He felt something inside him awakening that was more than just curiosity for science. It was a drive to prove to himself and the whole world that he was capable of more. And he was ready to go all the way. The following weeks passed in a blur. Elon hardly noticed anything around him, completely immersed in his work. In the lab, he spent hours refining his model. If he wasn't working on equations, he was reading scientific articles or testing new parameters. George was still trying to provoke him. One day, during a lecture, he threw a comment. Maybe Musk is just lucky? It won't happen again. Elon didn't even glance his way. His thoughts were focused on something else. But Emma noticed. Don't pay attention, she said one evening while they were sitting in the library. I'm not, Elon replied, though there was a slight coldness in his voice. Emma looked at him more closely. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Elon smiled, but a steely glint passed through his eyes. I know. On Saturday, Elon found himself back in the lab. He was almost done with his model, but there was one last detail, improving stability under maximum loads. He focused intently on the screen when he heard the door open. Working on the weekend? Professor Barkley's voice came through. Elon turned around. The professor stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. Yes, I want to check a few parameters, Elon answered. Barkley slowly approached and glanced at the screen. Is this a new model? Yes, I've improved the power regulation algorithm. In theory, it should reduce energy loss by 15%. Barkley studied the equations carefully. And how did you achieve this? By optimizing the nozzle angles and adjusting the fuel consumption according to temperature changes. Barkley raised an eyebrow. That's bold. Elon nodded. But if it works, it will open up new possibilities for engines in a vacuum. The professor thoughtfully stroked his chin. Have you tested it practically? Not yet. I was just about to. Barkley nodded. If you want, you can use our testing stand. Elon looked up, surprised. Really? Really? The professor smiled. I want to see if your model is as good as it looks on paper. An hour later, Elon was standing in front of a large testing stand. Engineers were finishing setting up the system. Emma sat in the room behind the glass, watching him. Ready? Asked the technician. Elon nodded. Power on. The system hummed, and the readings on the monitor began to rise. Elon focused on the screen. After a few seconds, the system reached its peak values. Hold on, Elon whispered. Suddenly, one of the parameters began to deviate from the norm. The temperature is rising. The technician shouted. Adjust the cooling flow, Elon quickly responded. The technician followed the command, and within a few seconds, the readings stabilized. Power is stable at 110%. The technician exclaimed. Emma smiled widely behind the glass. Barkley was watching the monitor intently, arms crossed over his chest. It's working, he said calmly. For now, Elon replied. He approached the monitor and checked all the readings. The system was running stably at maximum power. This is a breakthrough, Barkley said quietly. Elon smiled. I knew it was possible. The technician turned off the system, and the lab fell silent. Elon turned to the professor. What's next? Barkley nodded. Now we'll test it in real conditions. Elon felt a fire ignite within him. He knew this was just the beginning. That evening, he sat on the roof of the dormitory, gazing at the stars. Emma approached and sat beside him. You did it, she said. Not yet, Elon replied. This is just the beginning. She smiled. You already have a plan, right? Elon smiled back. Of course. The next week, Professor Barkley organized real-world tests at the testing ground. The whole team gathered in the morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. Elon stood at the center of the events, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, calm and focused. The engine was mounted on the test stand. Elon personally checked all the parameters before starting. Ready? Asked Barkley. Ready, Elon replied confidently. He pressed the start button on the panel. The engine hummed to life, and the readings on the monitor began to climb. The first 10 seconds went by without any issues. Then, the power started increasing, but all the parameters stayed within normal limits. Temperature stable, thrust at 115%, shouted the technician. Emma watched from the control room, fingers crossed. George stood a little aside, with a tense expression on his face. Output power at maximum, said the technician. The engine ran for another 10 seconds without any glitches. Then Elon pressed the shutdown button. The engine gradually silenced. The lab fell silent. It's a success, Barkley said quietly. Elon felt relief wash over him. He looked up and saw Emma smile. It really works, she said. Elon nodded. I knew it was possible. George approached, his face tense. You just got lucky, he muttered. Elon looked at him with a calm gaze. Success isn't luck, George. It's the result of hard work. George said nothing and walked away. Later that evening, Elon and Emma sat on the dormitory roof, gazing at the night sky. What now? Emma asked. Now new tests, new projects, new opportunities, Elon replied. Will you always work like this? Elon smiled. This isn't just work. It's part of who I am. She rested her head on his shoulder. I knew you'd make it, she said softly. Elon looked at her and replied, I knew it too. He looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the atmosphere, were new horizons. Elon knew that they were now one step closer. The next morning, Elon stood at the doorstep of the lab, watching the sunrise. The warm light fell on the glass walls of the building, reflecting off the metal surfaces. Behind him stood Emma, and next to them was Professor Barkley. "This is just the beginning," said the professor, placing his hand on Elon's shoulder. "Yes," Elon nodded, "but now I know we can do more." The engine was working perfectly, and in fact, it exceeded expectations. The team received an offer for a joint project from one of the leading space companies. Professor Barkley insisted that Elon lead this part of the research. George disappeared from the team. He never acknowledged Elon's success, but it no longer mattered. The team worked like a well-oiled machine, and the result was clear. Emma stepped closer and took Elon's hand. "You did it," she said with a warm smile. "We did it together," Elon replied. He took a deep breath, feeling the mixed sensation of relief and inspiration in the air. New challenges, new discoveries lay ahead, and he was ready for it all. Elon looked up at the sky, where the morning star shone brightly above the horizon. "Next, space," he said. Emma laughed. "I guess you're already thinking about a new project?" "Always," Elon smiled. They stood together, looking at the boundless sky. Ahead of them was an entire universe, and Elon knew this was just the beginning of his journey.